So welcome to this fireside chat with digital expert to the Executive Vice President of the European Commission and Commissioner for Competition, Margrethe Vestager, Mr. Werner Stengg. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, thanks for having me.
We're very pleased to have you. My name is Asha Allen, and I am the Advocacy Director for Europe Online Expression and Civic Space for the Centre of Democracy and Technology Europe Office. And today we're joining you from Brussels as part of our annual Future of Speech Online event. And we hope and are very sure that you've had an incredibly informative couple of days so far of events. But thank you for joining us for this conversation. So welcome to you, Werner. Thank you so much for joining us, especially at this very busy time for you and your colleagues. We are being joined by an international audience of stakeholders this evening. So if I could ask you to introduce yourself to our audience.
Yes, with pleasure. So I'm Werner Stengg. I'm Austrian by nationality, work for the Commission. I've been doing digital stuff for more than 10 years. And it's exciting until today because, you know, I'm just witnessing what is happening out there, which affects all of us every day in whatever we do. And being able to help now also the Executive Vice President in conducting her digital business and guiding us through this digital world is a lot of fun and a privilege.
I would fully agree with you there on it being a lot of fun. It's so brilliant to hear your profile. And so you mentioned you've been part of this for the last 10 years. So I'm going to get into it because I'd love to hear some more from your expertise. And you have alluded to already working for the Executive Vice President. You've been quite instrumental in developing a key piece of legislation that may be generation defining, actually, in a sense, thinking about the changes in the last 10 years. And that's the EU's Digital Services Act, which has just entered into law. Some of us are celebrating this coming into law just in November. It's an ambitious regulation, of course, with potentially far-reaching consequences. So we wanted to ask you, as someone who was very much there and deep in the weeds of the process, could you run us through what the theory and approach of you and your colleagues were when you were drafting the legislation, particularly thinking about things as, you know, balancing provisions around illegal content and the preservation of free expression?
Yeah, with pleasure. We really have to go back in time a little bit because the DSA did not happen overnight. It's not that we woke up one day and said, oh, wouldn't it be fun to do the DSA? It's rather sort of the result of almost 10 years of work, if you want, on content related matters. Because when I became responsible for the e-commerce directive back in 2011, we already started to investigate some of the issues out there. And already back then, more than 10 years ago, it was around, obviously, some content that may not be removed quickly enough. But when we started to look into this, we found out that in turn, there was also a lot of content that should never have been removed in the first place. So that was really the first recognition of, oh, be careful here. You know, it's a two-sided issue here. Then while we continued working on this, in parallel, the platform economy became stronger and stronger. And with that also the influence that some players have on content moderation. So it was not just a mere issue anymore that there may be a hosting service provider that acts too quickly or not quickly enough. It was also that in addition, there was just a handful of companies that moderated all the content for us. So whatever decisions they took did not just affect individuals amongst us, but it affected societies and democracies overall. Right. So the longer we worked on those issues, the more complex actually the issues became, the more urgent it became to address them, and the more important it was not to make any mistakes when doing so.
Yeah, precisely. I can imagine there was a lot of pressure to kind of address those questions, especially around this last point on making sure you found that balance and not making any mistakes when you were doing that. And so were there any kind of specific challenges that, you know, come to mind when you think of drafting a legislation that was going to act in this very horizontal way that would try and strike that balance without making any mistakes? Were there specific challenges that you had to face?
Well, many, of course. And as you can imagine, also lobbying was coming from all sides, which, however, also turned out to be an advantage, because it was not just a simple debate of a file where you have one position on the one end and another one on the other, but because every part of society is somehow concerned, people were sort of in their arguments balancing each other out, you know, and the more you listened, the more you learned, and the more you saw the multi-dimensions. The interesting thing was that when we put out our ideas for the DSA, we quickly saw consensus building around them about the main principles. And that was quite a relief and surprise, because some of the obstacles, you know, was, can we keep the liability exemption, sort of the European version of Section 230 in the US? Or should we follow some stakeholders that said, oh no, that has fallen out of time, there's no justification for this anymore. Coming back to the large platforms of today, they are not just intermediaries, passive, but they make a lot of money with this, so why should they? So there was a basic decision where we said, no, hang on. It's very, very important, especially for freedom of expression, and to avoid a surveillance internet, that we maintain this principle of limited liability. But at the same time, we had the idea we must also address the problems that those people legitimately want to address. Yeah, so we said, okay, let's decouple this from liability, and that was probably our strongest idea throughout the whole process. Let's decouple that. We leave liability as it is, but we impose other direct positive obligations on platforms to mitigate the risks that may be associated with their services. And I think that was the breakthrough, actually.
I agree with you that I think the due diligence chapter of the DSA in itself was what I think many refer to as like this groundbreaking characteristic of the legislation itself, and the very kind of two-pronged approach that you and your colleagues took when kind of trying to think about this in that very horizontal way. And so, of course, as now the legislation has entered into law, the next step is going to be bringing that to life. Do you have reflections on how the ambition of you and your colleagues will be best approached as we move forward?
Well, I think we are all up to a learning process here. This is not just any piece of law that now needs to be complied with, because it's very new to start with. It will operate in a fast-moving environment, and it contains quite some flexible elements, and on purpose, because there may be other laws out there that are very prescriptive, right? And as a company, you wouldn't know exactly what to do to comply. You do 1, 2, 3, and you're fine. And the enforcers would have the same list of topics, you know, and everybody would agree on what needs to be done. We couldn't be as prescriptive here because the risks are evolving. They may be changing. In 2 years from now, you may find other practices on, let's say, social media platforms or on marketplaces that we don't know today. And the DSA contains some elements like this risk assessment methodology, where we say, well, if you're a very large platform, you have to assess year on year if there's any risk to fundamental rights, to illegal content, to disinformation, whatever it may be. And then you need to come up with credible risk mitigation measures. And then we have to look at that and the world with us to see, well, are these adequate measures? So there is, both for the platforms, the challenge of coming up with solutions that are effective and proportionate and meet the requirements of the law, and for us collectively to see whether this is indeed what needs to be done. So there's a lot of question marks, and we all need to learn collectively on how best to put this into music.
Absolutely. And I think it's going to be one of those learning process that all the stakeholders that you probably engaged with during the development process are going to learn together and have an opportunity to contribute. But I did just want to draw on one thing that you mentioned there, and that was thinking about the other laws and what is happening in other contexts and what companies and others have to think about from a more global perspective. Now, you're in a fantastic position, having being part of the European Commission that was able to help shape this. But as you, as an EU stakeholder, Do you have reflections about developments that are happening globally in the US? You mentioned Section 230, for example, that are related to some of the same areas that the DSA touches upon, and any kind of developments that you've seen that have piqued your interest there?
Well, quite obviously, what we are looking at are global phenomena. I mean, the things that we are addressing in the DSA are seen all over the globe, and they're also being discussed by many jurisdictions out there, right? The US, obviously, and there's been discussions on Section 230 for a long time and whether it was still adequate and this, that, and the other. But you also see discussions in Australia and New Zealand, in Canada and elsewhere, in the UK, the Online Harms Act and things like this, right? So discussions are taking place everywhere. So I think there's also, at least among the like-minded, let's call them like-minded nations, also an agreement that there is something that needs to be addressed. We may not always immediately agree on how that should be addressed, but at least, you know, as long as we all believe in the open internet and in the importance of fundamental rights and that we don't want mass surveillance. So if there's agreement on some principles, then all the rest is much easier. Now, when we discuss with the US, for instance, in the context of the TTC, which just happened again at the beginning of this week near Washington, we're not discussing the DSA or the DMA, but we're discussing all sorts of digital challenges together and to see whether we can find common solutions. Now, both sides on the Atlantic, for instance, would know that content moderation is a critical thing. Now, we can work on this and on artificial intelligence and on other issues together to see, okay, how would we want technology to be used in a way that doesn't undermine people's rights and values. So there's so much we can do together in order to also help companies, if you want, comply with our principles. Now, one side of the Atlantic may put those principles into law. The other side may probably not do that. But I guess we would all agree that the outcome of action of companies should be beneficial to our citizens.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a fantastic point on the agreement of the outcomes and the intent. I think it's what happens in the middle that may have slight differences in the approaches, thinking about it from either a regulatory point of view or due diligence obligations point of view, but the intent and the outcomes, you know, as you're mentioning there, are aiming to be the same. So it's incredibly interesting thinking about those developments. And I often think that during the DSA conversations as well, there was a lot of reflection, especially among civil society, of how much the DSA would shape that global conversation, actually, because the EU was very much taking, and you and your colleagues were very much taking a step that I think many had been waiting for a very long time. And so there was some bated breath about how this would go and how this would be influential in that way. And so do you also see and have that hope that the DSA will shape a bit more concretely some of the confines or the lines of that conversation moving forward?
I seriously think it does. Because I think we have discussed this for longer and probably more profoundly than in other parts of the globe. And we see lots of people that come and talk to us from also the other jurisdictions, right? And saying, well, we're also working on online harms, this, that, and the other. Can you share your thoughts and experience with us, right? So I think everybody is very eager to learn from one another. It doesn't mean that everybody has to learn from us. We're very happy also to hear great ideas from other sides, right? But I do think that if we indeed can demonstrate that our law produces fair and balanced results, that there is a big likelihood that others will jump on the bandwagon.
So we absolutely share that hope, of course, having worked very closely with you and many others on the Digital Services Act, that of course, that we have that very high hope for it as well. So lastly, I just want to come to you, now that we're in the conversation of this international context, to ask you to share with our audience, many of whom may be policymakers, legislators themselves, stakeholders, what were your lessons learned, and what advice actually would you give to other policymakers or legislators when it comes to establishing obligations, but also responsibilities for online platforms?
Well, that's a very big question. I think I already anticipated some of this in my previous answers. The first one would be that you really need to strike good balance, and in your due diligence obligations. Due diligence does not just mean remove content. Due diligence also means make sure that content that is perfectly legitimate is protected, or at least that there are safeguards and redress possibilities and so on. So it's both sides, removal and over removal and under removal, if you want, that need to be looked at. Now, the other lesson that we learned was that that transparency is the starting point for all of it. Because when we were already 10 years ago looking into those phenomena of under removal, over removal, we always found out that we did not find out enough because the data was lacking. Why was it lacking? Because that was in the hand of some operators only, and it was under their control. It was their algorithms that decided what happened. It was only in their internal books that people knew what had happened. But the outside world didn't know. And then we said, oh my God, this affects society overall. It affects individuals, but it affects society at large. And yet we don't even have information on what is happening to all of us. So that was then this learning point of saying, well, we need to bring more light into this. So it's not just about the obligations on those platforms that do have control over the content. It is already to make what they do transparent to all of us. This is why we also open that up to researchers and not just to regulators. That's probably is also an important lesson that we felt we cannot on our own challenge some of the best equipped companies in the world, technically speaking, right? Mm-hmm. They have the expert. Not only do they control the systems and run the show, they also have the world's leading experts in terms of algorithms and data science and AI and what have you. So it would be very arrogant to think that now the European Commission or any other authority comes and says, we will be checking your algorithms, right? Yeah. So we decided we need to crowdsource this as well. We need to open up those closed systems, create entry points for researchers, for organizations, for civil rights organizations like yourself to come in and see what is happening to content. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm coming back to this. We should collectively learn, but this is only possible because we have opened up this window into something that didn't have windows until today.
It's so interesting because I think some initial analyses of the Digital Services Act kind of quantified it as this data gathering machine, this legislation that was going to help us gather as much data as possible so we could make those steps and do the kind of collective learning that you're talking about here. So it seems to me it's always useful and beneficial to think about it in that global and international context, because we have to do that collective learning in that specific way. And so that's so interesting. For those of you who have joined us with the DSA now into law, but it is of course the first step. It will be coming into fully force in the beginning of 2024. So we still have a little ways to go, but it's been fantastic to be able to speak with you, Werner. Did you want to share any last thoughts or comments for our audience today?
Well, I think that my key message and wish is always for democracy at the end of the day to prevail. I think we are all concerned by this, and that's you, and that's me, and that's my kids. And I just want all of us to be empowered in our society, be able to control what we do, what happens to our data, know what we see, why we see things. It's just some very basic things, that many of us may take for granted, and probably my kids have never asked themselves those questions. But I know that they may not always see what they should be seeing. And so I think it is really important for us to benefit from this wonderful internet, which has brought so much to us. So we need to protect it, we need to cherish it and make sure that it follows democratic principles.
Protection and founded in democratic principles. I couldn't have said it better myself. Werner, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been amazing speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.